This is Across the Atlantic. We provide actionable insight on geopolitics at the intersection of capital markets. Today, I'm joined by Tom Pyle. Tom is the president of the Institute for Energy Research, or the IER, and its advocacy arm, the American Energy Alliance, AEA, where he develops the organization's free market policy positions and implements education efforts for key energy stakeholders, including lawmakers, agency officials, industry leaders, consumers, and the media. Prior to joining IER, Thomas held numerous positions in the private sector and on Capitol Hill. He also managed the Department of Energy on the presidential transition team for President-elect Donald Trump. Tom, appreciate you hopping on. Thanks for making time in your busy schedule.
Absolutely. Great to be here. Thanks a lot, Garrett.
Yeah, of course. So we'll just get us kicked off by talking everything energy today. And of course, this program or this show being focused on geopolitics, I think a really good place to start in this conversation on energy security and just energy in general is going to be Russia's war on Ukraine. Get your thoughts there. So to set the scene and to give some context for everyone, Russia's war on Ukraine, obviously still ongoing, has changed a lot of different things. I think, reworked in a lot of ways global alliances. I think it's also reworked a lot of consumption that happens around the world, including energy. So, Tom, in your opinion, your thoughts, this obviously falls and has really big implications for energy markets, global energy markets. And the thing that I go to and think of most often is Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. That's definitely changed European consumption. So that as kind of the backdrop and the background here, how do you think Russia's war in Ukraine has changed global energy markets and energy security?
Well, I mean, in the first place, and great question, you have to take the story, wind it back about 10 years or so. The EU and the European countries, in this quest to sort of green everything, imposed or went forward with a very aggressive strategy to basically replace oil and gas, hydrocarbons with renewables. And at the same time, in Germany in particular, they had began to try to eliminate their nuclear fleets as well. And so what happened was, slowly and steadily, we saw this almost complete dependence on Russian gas in Europe. Okay, and when you depend on Russia or one country for your energy, that's not a good strategy for for national security, for energy security, for the ability of Europe to have a diversified energy source. And so combine that with sort of these little tests that Vladimir Putin had over the years, right? Georgia, for example, under President Bush, and I believe President Trump mentioned this even in his speech, when you had the Obama administration and Crimea, and nothing happened. So you combine this complete dependence on Russian gas, almost complete dependence on Russian gas, brought about by Nord Stream 2, and then you combine it with this testing of wills that Vladimir Putin had over those years, and then you had the invasion. Okay, so what have we seen since the invasion? Near panic in Europe, rightfully so. This is the first land war in Europe in a very, very long time.
Yeah, right.
And also sort of a what are we going to do moment, not only for Europe, but the United States and other nations as well. And so you had sort of almost a shock to the system of what had been going on in Europe, and a scramble to figure out how to secure natural gas. Very, very tough that first year, if you recall.
Yeah.
Bad winter, stocks were way down, and in some cases, it was U.S. LNG to the rescue, right?
Right.
Our manufacturers stepped up. Even our president, who is not overly pro oil and gas, and that's sort of being diplomatic, recognized the need to allow this to happen. And so slowly and surely, Europe began to diversify its supply and imports of natural gas, reduce its dependence on Russia's natural gas. Then you had the Nord Stream 2 explosion, which we still don't really know who did it.
Right.
But what has happened since then? You talk about how it's changed the markets, right? Because that's what this is about.
Yeah.
All these sanctions against Russian oil was designed to sort of cripple the funding for the war. Well, no, it didn't. Europe is now very low in terms of its imports of Russian energy. But guess who's now 90% of Russia's oil and gas reserve, China and India. So you talk about alliances, right?
Right.
India is kind of a neutral partner. They kind of come and they kind of go. They kind of play around and they try to like be involved with everybody. But China, this is troubling.
Yeah.
This is very troubling. You have a Russia that's dug in. We have not seen any thought anyway that Vladimir Putin would like to stop doing what he's doing in Ukraine. And now you have a China that has increasingly gotten more and more cozy with Russia. So it's a real problem. And I just want to also, we talk about all these big things. I also want to say we can't forget how it impacts people. Right. Europe is paying huge amounts of money for their energy. It has harmed in some cases killed people. And then lastly, we are seeing what I would say is this shocking deindustrialization in Europe, which cannot bode well for them in the long term.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a lot of good points here. I mean, you mentioned India and China as big buyers of Russian energy in general, where you see a lot of Western European countries, I think rightfully choosing, not to, or trying to at least wean themselves off. Because I mean, this question of energy security is inherently tied to national security. And we got a stark reminder of that, especially the Germans got a stark reminder of that with the onset of the war, just realizing how dependent they were truly for their energy security and on Russia, how much of that they were outsourcing to Russia. And another good point you bring up is the question of industrialization and deindustrialization. So, at what inflection point do countries choose energy security over meeting their climate goals, or vice versa? Do they choose meeting their climate goals over energy security? And I think what we're finding and what we're seeing in Asia, in Europe, pretty much all over the globe, is that countries are going to make that trade-off. It's all about energy security. They don't want to make these huge cuts to their energy security just to meet these climate goals, right? They don't want, in other words, they don't want to deindustrialize to meet their climate goals, which I think is right. Well, that's fantastic. And then I think a good dovetail into our next piece here, Tom. So, what are your thoughts on how the U.S. has changed its energy security mix over the past few years? You mentioned U.S. LNG coming to the rescue in large part, especially during the early parts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and honestly, still going on to this day.
Except for the pause. So.
Yeah, right. Except for the current pause, unfortunately. So that'll be interesting to see what comes, this November. But what does the U.S. energy look like today? So, in other words, what are we burning to get, and what are we using to, supply our own domestic needs? And then I think it would also be interesting to get into, obviously we have a lot of supply here. The U.S. as of 2023 was the largest exporter of LNG globally. Which was really interesting. So, we are putting out a lot into the world. But so one, what does the U.S. energy mix look like today? And I guess, what are we putting out there to the world?
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't have the exact number in terms of the amount, but we did surpass Qatar as the world's largest exporter of LNG. And we just to talk about the pause was a pause on new approvals for terminals,
Right.
which they say, well, it's only temporary, and we're not stopping all the existing contracts. Well, what that does is send a signal and to folks who want to purchase 30-year contracts of
Right.
LNG. They say, well, how do I know in 4 years or 8 years or whatever, next election cycle that, you're going to be able to do this? And meanwhile, you have other countries like Qatar saying, don't worry about us. We'll handle that. Right. So
Right.
the people who are supporting this say it's not impacting the market. It will have an impact on the market. Let's not kid ourselves.
Right.
The energy mix today, in spite of all the conversations about renewables, the hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies for renewables, particularly wind and solar in the United States, which has modeled itself after Europe, ironically. The mix of energy today is about 83% hydrocarbon. Okay. In 2014, it was about 82% hydrocarbon.
Right.
In 2007, it was slightly more.
Yeah.
But you see my point. The
Yeah.
biggest difference is the molecules. The coal generation has been reduced to about, say, 20% of our consumption, and natural gas had basically taken the slack up. So renewables, yes, they have increased, but they're additive. They're not replacing these resources. And so what you have is a policy of injecting renewables into a system and kind of like figuring out what happens after that, and a largely a system that has been unchanged in terms of the energy pie.
Right.
The difference being the natural gas versus oil, but the percentages are roughly the same.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, I think that's super helpful. So, we talk about what the U.S. energy mix looks like, what our current use, and what does that pie of energy use look like, Tom? So appreciate that. But given this backdrop again, just heightened geopolitical volatility, a lot of these U.S. allies and the U.S. itself, where do we get our energy from? We're asking a lot of these big questions. What does production look like for traditional fossil fuels? So obviously oil and gas, perhaps renewables. So from your vantage point, how do you see production forming in the U.S.?
Well, again, sort of like when I started, maybe take a step back first and then look forward.
Yeah.
Since the shale revolution, the United States, I don't think a lot of people realize this, the United States is responsible since 2012 for 90% of the total, 90 plus percent of the total increase in global oil production.
Wow.
The incremental increase in oil production came from the United States of America.
Wow.
And it has had incredibly dramatic impacts on the attitudes and the strategies of other global oil players. The Saudis let's just be frank, they tried to bury the shale producers
Oh yeah.
a couple of times with their production quotas and things, and that just hasn't happened. We are now seeing these really insane events happening in the Middle East that would send shockwaves through the markets that have barely a ripple, have made barely an impact, and it's that shouldn't be like brushed under the rug. That is a massive change in sort of geopolitical calculations around the world, and so the fact that we produce more here at home has literally sort of reshuffled the entire deck in terms of how alliances are formed, and the strength and power of the sort of OPEC, an OPEC plus, right? So
Right.
that's been a huge boon to our security, and also it has kept the price low.
Yeah. Right.
2007, 8, whatever, when Bush was running against Obama, oil was coming in around, you tell me, 140
Oh
bucks
yeah.
a barrel.
Mm-hmm.
Gas prices we had never seen before. And that doesn't happen anymore. We're seeing, the price of oil has been sort of flat
Yeah.
relative
Yeah.
speaking, right? So those are huge good things, I think, overall. Um, and it has a tremendous benefit for people too. And that's why, and producing energy and oil and gas at home means stable prices for consumers so that they can sort of budget that into the mix, right? And then
Yeah.
when you do things like um, promote policies that curtail that production or try to hamstring that production or give a leg up to other energy sources, you're you're sending a signal to the domestic industry that you'd rather do business elsewhere. And that's baked into their calculations of how much money they want to make, how much capital they want to invest in energy projects domestically. So
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. I think that's incredibly helpful. And I think a really interesting piece of that is, and this wasn't on our docket, but I want to get your thoughts here. I'm really curious. So I mean, we're talking a lot about production. You mentioned OPEC Plus. How do they play into calculus? And what kind of levers does production essentially give the United States um, to maneuver and navigate geopolitically, right? If we're having to, and just what that means in simple terms is, if we are having to go to these other countries hat in hand asking for asking for contracts for energy, that gives us less maneuverability on other topics geopolitically, right? And vice versa, if we are energy dominant, energy strong, energy independent, we're actually able to maneuver freely. We don't have to go hat in hand, et cetera, et cetera. So, I'm just curious, Tom, what are your thoughts? Obviously, November's coming up quick. The RNC just happened this week. We're talking a lot about production right now during a Biden administration. What does, in your vantage point, what does production look like under a potential Trump presidency administration? Would we anticipate seeing any sort of increase in production? Would you see it being the same? Curious for your thoughts there.
well, when you shut down and cancel leases on federal lands and prevent the opportunity for the energy producers here at home to have the opportunity to produce on those lands, um, then yes, I think you will see potentially an increase in production. Um, people say, well, we're still producing more. What's the issue? Well, the issue is these actions, and we've identified over 225 very specific actions that this administration or its allies on Capitol Hill have taken to make it more challenging, to make it more difficult to produce oil and gas, that's the signal that your government is sending. As we don't want to help, we don't want to give you a leg up. We want to kneecap your ability to do this. And so, what I think the if President Trump were to be reelected, I think he would probably work aggressively to undo a lot of the executive actions immediately that the Biden administration has put forward, and then sort of figure out what in the regulatory rulemaking space he would need to do, and then lastly, of course, assuming the makeup of Congress, if it's favorable to President Trump, would have an opportunity to further kind of get rid of some of the subsidies or the carrots for renewables through the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, does that mean whole scale removal of those? Probably not. But what it means is that you go from a posture of you wanting the industry to do well,
Right.
as opposed to treating the industry like there's some pariah. And that's a
Yeah. Or kneecapping, like you said.
right, and that's a
Yeah.
big shift. And then what you do is, I mean, I have heard companies want to invest offshore. They think long term that even though the capital costs are way higher up front, that
Yep.
they think long term that that's a good play, given what they see in terms of the growth projections of growth of overall energy demand, both in this country and around the world. And so, they're not going to do that if they have an administration that could yank their leases out from under them
Right.
without batting an eye. So I do think that it would be a much more, favorable atmosphere or environment for the investment community and the producers themselves.
Yeah, no, and that makes a lot of sense. I figured that would be the answer, but I had to ask you just given your background on Capitol Hill, so appreciate that. Now, and this follows, I think, naturally into the next question. Again, we're talking about the U.S. energy mix. We just talked about production. Now, should we be concerned, right? We have case studies currently that are underway, and I use case studies pretty freely. But we see how Western Europe is dealing with a lack of energy security and trying to recoup and get back up to par. Essentially, where do we get our energy from? So, in the next 5 to 10 years, should the U.S. be concerned about its energy security? I think a lot of the times what you've seen is a lot of statements from a lot of different people saying, "Look, we have liquid gold, right? That's been the term." Not sure if you saw the RNC this week, but that term was
Yeah.
used a lot. Drill, baby, drill, right? So we have, it seems, a lot of capacity that we don't need to be worried over the next 5 to 10 years. But I'm just curious, what are we missing? What are people not thinking about? Should we be concerned, or maybe we shouldn't?
We should be concerned in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 50 years, the next 100 years. We should always
Okay.
be concerned about energy security.
Yeah.
Energy security as you said, is the inexorable link to national security.
Yeah. Right.
And if you create an environment whereby you become dependent on somebody, one or two players, those players control your energy. They control you in a lot of ways. And so we
Yeah.
should always be concerned about our energy security. We just did a report at IER. We updated our North American energy inventory. And we did this in 2011 before the shale revolution. And the numbers were astonishing back then. And this was before we actually got into these shale plays. We have since produced north of 180 billion barrels since the study came
It's
out,
crazy. Yeah.
and yet our reserves have gone up.
Wow.
In the updated inventory, the numbers have gone up. We keep finding more and more. We have the most, as President Trump said. I think he got that stuff from us, but most oil and gas underneath our lands and waters than any other nation in the world.
Yeah.
It is a hydrocarbon-based energy system, and hence it's a hydrocarbon-based economy. Now, what would the electrification of everything, do to that? You'd still be burning hydrocarbons for electricity. There's no doubt about it. But you would also be basically shifting from a hydrocarbon-based energy system to that of a minerals and materials-based energy system, because the components of batteries and all that come from the earth. They're
Yep.
mined, they're processed. Right now, today, it might change in the future, but right now, today, China owns or controls 80% of that entire supply chain.
It's crazy.
80. So
Yeah.
just think about it. US number one producer, most of the resource. China, they don't have as much oil. That's one of the reasons that they are perfectly happy to force electric vehicles onto their public, because that is an energy security play for them.
Yeah.
Not an environment play for them. It's an energy security play for them. They're just sort of covering it up with some green shade in order to participate in all this stuff that's going on in the EU and everything else. So yeah, it's absolutely critical. And people who represent us in the government, on Capitol Hill, and the administration, no matter which administration, should take this stuff very, very seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned a few good points there. I think, like, probably primarily is going to be the China component of this conversation and everything around. You mentioned they control a lot of the refining of the critical minerals that are needed for a lot of the green technology for this broader energy transition, climate goals, what have you, right? And how they also are a net importer of energy, which is very interesting. And like you said, the U.S. is not. So these are, I mean, it's just a completely different, two completely separate pictures that you're looking at. And I think another interesting piece of this, and why I think Americans in the U.S. Should be focused on this and should care about where their energy comes from and energy security and everything essentially that we're talking about today. Is a lot of the folks, no matter where you're sitting, that are pushing the energy transition, or supporters, proponents, whatever, and that want to meet these aggressive climate goals and climate targets. And I'll pick on California here. Initially, I think that's okay. I'm from there. Um,
I
they
got
want to
roots there
go.
too. I went
Yeah.
to USC and lived in Northern California for a while. So
So you get it. So you
yep,
get
yep.
it. They want to go all electric cars by 2035. And, when I was growing up there, they did not have rolling blackouts. But by the time I was leaving to come out to Houston, Texas, they do, in fact, now have rolling blackouts. And so imagine, fast forward to 2035, what that looks like if everybody in the States driving electric cars. I mean, it's just wild. So I think the attitude of, we need to push really, really hard, no matter what the cost, to meet these goals, these arbitrary goals. I think a lot of those attitudes start to shift and start to change when those same people go to flick on the light switch and the light doesn't turn on. Right? You stop caring where the source of your energy comes from very quickly if you have no access to energy. And I think that's probably true everywhere around the country.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think for the longest time, the sort of absolutely any cost net zero type approach didn't have a lot of immediate impacts,
Yeah.
right? We didn't have, the demand was roughly flat. Um, there was a lot of gap to fill. Renewables could come online and not really disrupt the electricity grid with the intermittency. But
Yeah.
the more and more intermittency that you add to the system, the harder it is to keep that system going in a functioning way. And that's what you're seeing in California, but also in Texas to some extent, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then the other thing is, you mentioned it when they don't have the ability to flip the switch. I agree with you, except
Yeah.
I would just take it a step further and say a lot of the people who are making these decisions are wealthy enough to prevent them to have workarounds for that.
Right. Right. Yeah.
They'll have their full generators in their backyards. Their couple few diesel powered or natural gas powered generators in
Right.
their backyard, so their lights will stay on, but ours won't.
Yeah. Right.
And that's, I think, the difference there is that they don't. They're less concerned about the impacts of people in this conversation. And that here at IER, that's what we do a lot of this for that very reason, because a lot of people forget about that human element, or that consumer, ratepayer, middle class
Yeah.
family member, part of this conversation. So
Yeah, no, 100%. And you mentioned the human component as well, I think earlier on. And I think it's a great piece because, again, I think so often in our world, yours and mine, we're looking at a lot of data, we're looking at a lot of statistics. But like you said, for every increment of metric, or every increment of data, there's people behind that, especially when you're talking about energy and especially lack thereof. I think things and the math on a lot of what we're talking about starts to change when you have millions, hundreds of thousands, whatever the number may be, of people that don't have access to energy, which is crazy. And I think, Tom, we're on a good little thread here. We're talking about climate goals, meeting those, and the intersection again of energy security. Um, and I'll set the scene, give some context here for this. So you undoubtedly know about the Paris Accords, net zero by 2050. Forget the exact number of countries that have signed up for that, but plenty of countries have signed up for that to meet that goal. So, we're about to be in 2025, so call it 25 years away from 2050. And it doesn't really look like we're going to meet globally net zero, or this 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I'm curious, what in your eyes does a successful energy transition look like globally? What does that look like for the United States, the US? Um, is an energy transition worth pursuing or even realistic by 2050? Because frankly, from everything I look at and the people that I talk to, it doesn't seem like we're going to get there. Not to say it's not worthy, but it's just going to take much, much longer than folks realize. You mentioned critical minerals. It's going to take a lot more of those. It's going to take a lot of capital. I think it's estimated to be $150 trillion, which no country on the planet has that kind of money. So 2050 just seems like a crazy goal to get to net zero by in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, so when I think about energy transition, I add the word forced in front of it. We've always
Yeah.
transitioned. The energy transition is an ongoing phenomenon,
Yeah.
right? I mean, advances in technology. I mean, prior to the Industrial Revolution, which was an energy revolution, we were basically burning biomass, and then we found this coal, and we figured out how to use it, and
Yeah.
these things happened,
Right.
and now look at this country where we flipped the script, as I mentioned earlier, about our coal consumption versus natural gas. We burned whale oil in our street lamps in Massachusetts. It's a constant transition to better, more efficient, more reliable, works harder, and I think that can and should continue. Um, I look at it as an energy addition, not an energy transition.
Yeah.
And I'm happy for a diversified energy pie. I think the more inputs you can put into that pie from different places, the better off we all are. Because again, we're not putting all our eggs in any one particular basket. But we cannot say that um, certain types of energy they're not all the same. Some are better than others,
Right.
right? And you can't like just ignore that in the conversation. And the way that you describe, what's that look like? What I think
Yep.
it looks like is what's happening, which is, I was just up in Canada and Alberta and Calgary, and we looked at some amazing technology in terms of like how to, for example, harden cement with less cement, and adding carbon to cement to make it lighter, use less material. What does that mean? We burn less energy to make concrete, right?
Yep.
So you can do it. You just you have to do it right. You have to do it smart. You have to figure. We can't force. We don't know enough as individuals if we're a bureaucrat at the UN or sitting at the EPA or even sitting in some of these companies. We don't know enough to say, wave a magic wand and say, thou shalt do this.
Right. Right.
We have to constantly innovate. We have to constantly, make these important goals and then be realistic about them. So, in terms of politically, these are arbitrary dates.
Right.
And
Exactly.
you've seen already the backsliding. Governor Hochul in New York, the day before they were supposed to do congestion, like create this, zone in Manhattan where if you crossed it, you'd have to pay the government. She canceled it at the last second. Why? Because it was politically like, a death sentence.
Yeah. Right.
Right. So these kind of things are important. You cannot wait. We are spending tremendous, as you mentioned, tremendous amounts of money trying to fit a square peg in a round hole in some instances,
Right.
where we should be looking for ways to utilize that which works well, i.e., hydrocarbon, embrace hydrocarbon, and challenge the industry to reduce emissions.
Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah, no, that's completely perfect. And you mentioned right now, I mean, where we stand technology wise, particularly in the US, I mean, there's a hydrocarbon based economy. That's how we grow GDP. That's how businesses get their inputs, make products, sometimes services, whatever it may be. But for right now, the current technology stack that we have in this country favors traditional fossil fuels, favors traditional hydrocarbons. Now, like you just said, the story of human progress is the story of energy expansion. We're always going through an energy transition, right? This current context of okay, an energy transition has to be green, and all these sorts of renewables. Sure, but this isn't anything novel or unique. We've been doing this since we've been on this planet. Uh, So that's a really interesting piece by this. And so I'm curious. I mean, do you think 2050 is something that the world will achieve, or I mean, are we looking at something a longer timeline than that?
Well, what I think we'll see is 2050 become 2065,
Yeah.
right? I think what you'll see is you're already seeing this in the markets. This, ESG, net zero, all of this stuff has sort of been front and center for a number of years now. And then all of a sudden you get this shiny toy over there, this AI, and demand for more electricity,
Yeah.
right? The IEA is projecting that we're going to need a whole lot more electricity in the next, 10 or 15 years.
I think it's
Uh,
about like double what we're using right now. It's crazy.
yeah, and at the same time, you've got, this um, set of rules that could potentially reduce by upwards of 20 or 25% of the current base load. At the same time, you want to electrify everything and increase that number even more. So
Right.
that's just dumb. It's not
Yeah.
like it's just dumb. It's
Well, it's bad math.
yeah, absolutely. And so I think that even the guys on who have been really backers of all this net zero stuff are starting to see the challenges, are starting to see the costs, are
Yeah.
starting to see the impacts, and aren't seeing the results.
Hmm.
They're not seeing the results, right? Emissions was in last year. Emissions was as high as they've ever been
Yep.
recorded. Global emissions. Also, production consumption was as high as it's ever been. And those dynamics aren't going to change, especially when there are still, and again, going back to that human element, there's still billions of people around the world who don't have access to electricity or light at
Yeah.
night and things like that, and we can't deny them that as well. So I think the debt. What I think happens is the sort of the framework changes, the deadlines move, and all of that, and you may even see sort of a shift in the rhetoric in some cases. Um, and so I'm not, I don't know what the future looks like. There might be some magic, solution to all this that you see in the sci-fi movies and things like that. But what I see is a world that is hungry for more and more power, um, and they're gonna do what it takes to secure it.
Yeah, I think that the last piece there, right? So the world is a world, you see a world that's hungry for more power. I think that's totally true. And you also mentioned some sci-fi technologies. I think that may be true in the future for renewables, maybe. But I think where it's probably more true right now, and you mentioned this AI, and I think that's also a very interesting component, something that we look at as well as far as the energy consumption of these AI technologies, GPTs, whatever it may be, these algorithms essentially. Um, I'm really curious too. It's wild, and you mentioned okay. At the same time, we're having this huge boom in energy demand. We're also trying to electrify everything. Talked about it's just bad math. I don't know how you get there. I mean, it seems that AI seems to be incredibly important. We need to pursue this technology. It has a lot of applications, national security, consumer directed, whatever. But to power this, I mean, it's just immense. And it seems like regular folks have to pick up that bill in a sense. I'm just curious if the institute has, and yourself, Tom, if you have any thoughts on AI and energy consumption, energy use.
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts about AI are similar to my thoughts about energy consumption in
Hmm.
general. Even without AI, the data centers themselves,
Yeah.
is causing or resulting in a need for more. If we do penetrate, if EVs say penetrate 15-20% of the market, that's still more. Um, and so, we're still going to need more power regardless of AI, but AI sort of, you know, compounds that significantly.
Yeah.
And what I think the tech companies, and this isn't a slight on them per se, but they, played this footsie with the green stuff and, well, we're 100% renewable and we're not
Right.
going to use all that coal and all that dirty stuff. And now all of a sudden they're like, oh, we're short power. What are we going to do? Oh, I know. We'll just buy the nuke stuff
Right.
that's out there already. right? We'll just get exclusive contracts for the nuclear. Well, that's 19% of the pie. So,
Yeah, right.
A, it's irresponsible for utilities to like shortchange the rest of their ratepayers.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly,
B,
exactly.
the molecules all flow on the same grid. And C, it's sort of a band-aid approach to this, which I think they've gotten themselves into a little bit of a box because they're sort of constrained from embracing more baseload generation. So, I would love it if they would, pivot and say, well, we need coal too, but I don't think that's going to happen. But
Right.
at a minimum, they should be talking about we need pipelines, we need infrastructure, we need to wheel this natural gas that we are blessed with,
Yeah.
and we will build AI, send data centers, all that, um, with natural gas plants, right?
Yeah.
If we
Hmm.
can do an SMR, a small modular reactor, if we can like pop a nuke on top of our roof someday, great. But
Sure.
we're years and years away from that as well.
Yeah.
Um, and so, I think that they just need to be grown. They have to be a little bit more grown up and be willing to say, yeah, let's rethink this whole baseload thing, and let's not exclude natural gas, and work with groups like ours to create a political climate where it's cool to build pipelines again.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think that's a huge solution, and so many funny things you just threw out there, right? So, putting a small reactor nuclear on site to power some of these data centers or AI algos, whatever. I mean, I've heard that being tossed around as well. But like you said, the technology just doesn't exist. It seems like a crazy like theory or something to talk about, but like this is being discussed at technology companies. I mean, this is how you supply yourself with immense amounts of energy that's required, while also I mean, a lot of these companies have their own climate target goals, whatever. And I think, like you just mentioned, they're quickly realizing, oh shit, how are we actually going to how are we going to get there with our current consumption, right? Well, that's fantastic. And then Tom, you also mentioned, working with the IER. Um, what's your work currently looking like over there at the Institute and at AEA?
Yeah.
Should also mention, and then why should Americans, in your perspective, why should Americans care about where our energy comes from?
Well, thanks for the question. IR, we're a research group, and we focus on policy for the most part and how it impacts those stakeholders you mentioned earlier, particularly consumers. So we do a lot of rapid fire sort of analysis of what conversations are taking place as they happen,
Yeah.
and put the numbers behind them and say, okay, well, if that's what you want, then here's what you get. And we think that informs policymakers, um, and makes other organizations who care about these issues better and smarter because we share a lot of our information with them. Right now, we're working on a very big sort of all-encompassing report on electric vehicles, the good, the bad, and the ugly,
Yep.
uh, and that will come out in the fall. The AEA, the American Energy Alliance, is a little bit of a different organization. It's an advocacy organization. We we take positions on things. We're for and against things.
Right.
Right now, we are for what we heard in Milwaukee. We
Yep.
are for a political platform that says energy is extremely important, and domestic energy production is extremely important, and we should have more of it. And so we're going to be getting engaged here as we get into the dog days of summer, on and being part of that conversation between now and the fall. And then we have our American Energy Scorecard, which we rate lawmakers on how they vote,
All
not how they
right.
talk. So every elected representative has a score. And if you're listening and watching, you can go to AmericanEnergyAlliance.org, type in your zip code, and you can find out how your elected representative is scoring on our scorecard, which is votes that lead to more freedom, more energy freedom, not less. So those are kind of the things we're working on here between now and when we see what happens on that fateful day in November.
That's right. That's right. Well, really appreciate it, Tom. Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna have to check that out. I'm gonna have to type in my own zip code and figure out what
You're
the
in Texas.
yeah, yep.
If you're not in Austin, you should be okay. So,
All right. I like I like the sound of that.
generally speaking. So,
Yeah,
and
right.
then the last one you said, why is this stuff important? Why should people
Yeah.
care about this?
Hmm.
Because energy is everything. It is embedded into the cost of every good and service. It is how we get around. It provides upward mobility, freedom. People say, well, you're just an energy group. We're a freedom group, really, is what we are. And people, the people who make less money annually spend a higher percentage of their money on their meeting their basic energy needs.
Yep.
That means they have to do without things. When bad policies or bad things happen in the world, that increase the cost of energy. And so we should all care about energy, where it comes from, how we get it, how we use it, because it is instrumental in our lives on an everyday basis. And that's true when you're without it.
Yeah, right.
You know,
Exactly.
I feel bad for y'all in Houston, after the hurricane because
Yeah.
it's hot.
It's
Uh,
hot. It's
it's
hot.
hot, and you need air conditioning, right? So, anyway, so yeah, it's a really important issue. We kind of we're biased, obviously, but we think that it is essential to be an energy literate consumer and voter out there.
Yeah. That's incredibly powerful way to leave it off, Tom. I think we'll wrap there, but I really appreciate the time. Everybody go check out the IER, Institute for Energy Research, as well as the American Energy Alliance, the AEA. We'll have links below. Tom, I want to thank you again. I know you're an incredibly busy guy, crazy schedule flying all over the place. So thank you again for spending the hour with me. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you. Take care.
Take care. Thank you so much.